and welcome to another edition of Bigfoots Pad Live. On the line with me today, I have my co-host Nick, and then we have a special guest with us today. We have author Paul Blake Smith with us, and we are going to be talking about a very interesting book and research that Paul did on a 1941 Missouri UFO crash. So I guess without further ado, we were kind of talking a little bit before the show. What do you think, Nick? Should we jump right into it?
Yeah, I'm really interested in what Paul has to say.
All right, Paul. So I tried to think of some questions I probably don't get out.
Thank you for coming on.
Yeah, so I tried to think of some questions you don't get asked.
Thanks for having me on. Goodbye.
Yeah, I didn't want to ask you questions you get asked 100 times, so I was trying to think of some unique questions.
There's only so many questions you can ask, but a lot of people, one of the things they want to ask me, so did this really happen? Do you really think it happened? And my candid answer is yes. Some of the evidence is scant. It is thin. Some of it is hearsay, but there's so many angles, and I'm currently rewriting my book. You see it over my shoulder there. Mo 41, the Bombshell Before Roswell, and gathering still more little bits and pieces of the story, confirming what I think happened, and it may even been a little bigger or more expansive than what people originally thought.
Yeah.
But it was so long ago. It was over 82 years ago. In fact, it may have happened this week in 1941. So not only are all the witnesses long since dead, but their children are in many cases deceased, and the grandkids don't know. And the people who were there at the site were all sworn to secrecy. A few did talk. Now, just a year or so ago, I got a Facebook message from a gentleman who had given me some information, and he wanted to keep a key name out of it. But he revealed that key name at last.
Yeah.
So I'm trying to follow up. There's a 95-year-old woman who may know plenty about this case, still alive in Cape Girardeau. So I look up her address. My source did not know where she lived. And I wrote out a series of questions for her and sent it. And I got it sent back to me unopened. She doesn't live here anymore. So I went to a second address and mailed it off, all my questions. And I just got it back yesterday. She doesn't live here anymore. So over two, she's 95. She could be deceased. She could be in a nursing home. I don't know what's left of her memory. It's if I could just talk to her. But her husband may have known about the crash, may have been at the site. That's the rumor, that he saw what happened. And it may be that she's even the one writing on the envelope when it comes back unopened that she no longer lives here. That could be her, and she doesn't want to talk about it.
Oh, yeah.
Well, there's a whole number of reasons why this has gone awry. It's so frustrating. It encapsulates the whole Cape Girardeau story. Just when you think you got something, it slips through your fingers.
Oh, yeah. We know how that is.
Yeah.
I guess this is a question you probably get asked 100 times. So I kind of have to ask this. So can you talk a little bit about your background? Because I know that's kind of important to how you found out about the story and why you're involved in it. And can you talk a little bit about how you heard about the story?
Okay. Your good buddy, Art Bell, around the year 1999, 2000, had a show with Linda Moulton Howe talking about this. And my ears perked up because I'm from Cape Girardeau. And I had not heard this story before, I'm embarrassed to say. So I started jotting notes and looking up what I could and thinking, well, someone needs to write a book about this. And I waited like over a decade, and I got tired of waiting. No one did. So I thought, well, I fancy myself a writer. I'll do this myself. And it took several years to piece together. It was my first book, and I made a few small mistakes. I was, for instance, convinced, I was sure that it happened April 12th. And I now know that was a mistake. And this book you see behind me is a revised edition of my 2016 book. And I revised it down to just late April, of the last few days in April 1941. The
Mhm.
daughter of the minister in this story that we'll talk about said that the minister's daughter-in-law gave birth May 3rd, and it was about a week or so after the big event in
Yeah.
that Cape Girardeau
Yeah.
farm field. So late April is as close as we can get. And there was no article in the paper. They made sure, the military, when they came in to take over, and we'll talk about that too,
Yeah.
is that you will not discuss this. This never happened. They made this clear, according to the granddaughter of the minister. You're never to speak of this ever again. And, you know, there was a show of force from military personnel and an FBI agent. And so people were, most of them, intimidated. Now, I did talk to, a few years ago, a woman who did not see the crash site, but she was 11 years old when it happened. And she told me she lived in a small town south of Cape called Chaffee, Missouri. And it was not too far from the crash site. And she said, I remember distinctly the adults talking excitedly about these little spacemen that died in their little spaceship. And it was in a farm field not too far between Chaffee and Cape Girardeau. So that's another piece of evidence. She said that they didn't use the term ET or UFO or even flying saucer. And I thought that helped make it more authentic, that she was telling the truth, because those terms weren't even invented yet in 1941. They just called them little men or little spacemen. And it was clear that they were not from this world. And so it had to have been just a complete shock. There was no movies, really. There was like a Buck Rogers movie, like a B movie, and it was really corny, and everyone's a human being in his little spaceship. That's about as close as you can get to sci-fi. It was not nearly as mainstream. People didn't give a thought to this, I'm sure, at all, especially hardworking farm families where it happened. So it had to have just freaked them out.
Oh, I'm sure.
I
just have one question before we have you tell the story about what happened. So I know since you grew up in the area, do a lot of the locals know about this, or do they ever talk about this? Do you know?
When I interviewed a lot of people in like 2014, 15, 16, some knew all about it. Yeah, I heard about that. I saw it on the History Channel, or I'd heard something from somebody. And other people like, what? Are you on drugs? Are you drunk, man? This stuff's just crazy. Man, you need to, lay off the pipe or something like that. Some were even hostile. They don't want to hear this nonsense. They think it's like a plot against their hometown. Or I got all kinds of reactions. I started to use the term aerial crash. Did you hear about an aerial crash in 1941? Starting to leave out the detail that it was extraterrestrial in nature, because that got so many people upset. And so I got a variety of reactions, and it's a reflection of the human condition. Now I think it's more well known, partly because of my books, and partly because it's been touched upon on Ancient Aliens now, where they showed the cover of my book. I was told that they were going to interview me for Ancient Aliens, and then they chickened out and figured, let's go with our stable of established UFO people and save on having to fly this guy out to California and interview him on camera, put him up in a hotel. It's just a lot cheaper to go with what they had. So I don't blame them too much. I was watching the show and I nearly spewed out my drink when they showed my book cover. And they left off my name at the bottom of it.
Oh, geez.
Thanks a lot, but at least it was great publicity, and I appreciated it. And they gave like 2.5 minutes to the story, which we can get into. But I'll point out that my stepmother grew up in Cape Girardeau, and she says she heard the story in the 1960s.
Yeah.
Now, that's well before people in the mid to late 1990s started to hear about this. And my stepmother is not a liar in any way. She's not even all that interested in the story, but she said, I heard that long ago. And I talked to a number of people who said, my grandparents used to talk about this in front of me. Why didn't I ask them some questions about this? They're gone now. But they would talk about it matter-of-factly. The spaceship crash that landed outside of town, and that the military came in and took it away. And that was a common thing in some families. They didn't even, hide it or speak obliquely in some families.
Oh yeah.
So, I grew up in Cape Girardeau, was born and raised there, educated there, went to college there, and left around January of 1997. And I live elsewhere in Missouri. But I find the case so interesting that I kept going back and researching it, trying to talk to people, figure out where this thing landed. And I began to figure out that it's probably best for my health if I don't tell people where it landed.
Yeah.
After hearing some stories, including yours before this
Oh
show,
yeah.
I don't want to come across as a coward, but I think there's such a thing as self-preservation, using your brains not to open your mouth and get yourself killed.
Yeah. So I guess the best way to go about this, I know we were talking a little bit before the show. So there's the main witness, I guess you would call it. As far as I know, the main witness that came forward was the granddaughter of an individual named William Huffman.
Yeah.
Can you talk about who William Huffman was and tell the story about how when he first enters the UFO crash story up until the point to where he leaves the crash site?
Yeah, Reverend Huffman was a fine man. He was a Baptist minister, and his job was to raise money for the Red Star Tabernacle Church in Cape Girardeau. It later became the Red Star Baptist Church, and I think it's closed down now. I was able to get in there and access their locked, sealed records room. Very kindly folks, and they said they thought very highly of Reverend Huffman. He was a good man and a good pastor. I went to his home on North Main Street in Cape Girardeau, and sure enough, the landowner pulled out the deed, the property deed. There it is. William and Floyd Huffman bought the house. They rented it at first, and then they sold it in 1944 and moved away during World War II. So there is no question there was a Reverend William Huffman who worked at the Red Star Tabernacle down the street, and that he was in the area and could have been available because he was a fundraiser and not quite preaching from the pulpit in April of 1941. I found out doing a little research that the Justice of the Peace lived right across the street from him. His house looked right out on Reverend Huffman's. And so on the night of the accident, Reverend Huffman said someone called the house associated with the Cape Girardeau Police Department. Didn't say it was a police officer.
Yeah.
Said associated. And that's exactly what a Justice of the Peace is. He works with the police in times of emergency. A Justice of the Peace, for instance, was called out to help out in the chain of evidence in the JFK murder in Dallas, Texas. Justice of the Peace Rose was his name. Well, that's just one example. So I can easily see that it was an all hands on deck situation in which they thought originally an airplane had crashed outside of town into a farm field. No one was thinking, aliens, spaceship, UFO, or anything like that. Reverend Huffman said he was called to give some sort of prayers and spiritual comfort. They undoubtedly thought there would be mangled, wounded people in an airplane that would need spiritual comfort, and maybe their relatives would show up grieving, especially for anyone who had passed away, who might want prayers said over their bodies. And that's exactly what he did. He went with this person associated with the police department in an unmarked car to the crash site. He didn't tell his family where he was going. But apparently other people had shown up, like the sheriff, the chief of police, or at least police officers. A member of the media was there, according to Reverend Huffman. He told his wife everything when he got home that night. And then he said, I'm going to tell you this story, and I'm never going to speak of it again. And he may well have lived up to that promise. He died in 1959. It was his wife, Floyd, who lived into the early 1980s, and she told the story to her daughter, Reverend Huffman's granddaughter. And she told the story in the 1990s. It got printed up in a letter and in a book briefly. And this was brought to the attention of UFO research and Friedman.
Oh yeah,
He came right, sir. So Yeah, Ryan S. Wood, another reputable researcher, came to Cape and did a ground search looking for any kind of debris or evidence. Then Linda Moulton Howe picked up the story. I don't Cape, but she took 1999,
Mm-hmm.
1941, was a judge in Cape Girardeau.
Mm-hmm.
A few years before, he was the Cape Girardeau city attorney, and he would go out at night on these police emergencies like this was. If he had just stayed in that job, he would have had the story of the millennium. He apparently did not go out and did not know the story at first. I suspect he learned it from his many contacts. He was on like city council and he knew all the legal lines in town. He was friends with Rush Limbaugh the first, the grandfather of the famous broadcaster. I've been told that Rush has told others that he also heard the story of a spaceship crash in the 1960s when he was in high school in Cape Girardeau. In the early 70s, he was a struggling DJ on the local radio station, and he had to earn extra income to make ends meet by where I was playing and pitching, and he was calling the balls and strikes behind home plate. Rush was called Rusty back then, but he was my umpire for Little League for 2 seasons.
That's actually pretty cool.
Yeah, I never met him. I never knew him. And I'm sorry that he passed away without commenting publicly on the Cape Girardeau story. If he recorded something, it hasn't been released. He's passed on, his father's passed on, and his grandfather. Grandfather was an extremely fine man. He was a city father of, in so many ways, if there was a Mount Rushmore, Rush the first would be the first person you would put on there.
Oh, yeah.
He lived to 104. My dad used to see him around town when he was past 100, being driven around and helped around by a beautiful young woman. And he had a sharp mind, and I just missed my chance. I didn't know about the Cape Girardeau story at the time. He passed away. Rush's father was an aviation expert and a pilot. He hung out at the airport, which was said to have been near the crash site. And so I'm sure Rush the second found out about it and told Rush the first, maybe when he was in high school in the 60s. So they're gone, and this is just another frustrating angle. I can't get a complete solid grip on this story, but all of the circumstantial evidence is just really, really compelling. And I think it did happen. I think it was creatures from another world had an accident of some sort, just like we can have an accident. And we know all about our atmosphere, electromagnetic pull, gravity, and everything. And aliens coming here don't know any of that stuff, So they had an accident. Who said they were perfect?
So my first question is, so when William Huffman goes to the crash site, so what exactly did he see at the crash site?
He said they got out of the car, walked about a fourth of a mile across this farm field, and they saw, to their great surprise, a fire. The flames were being put out by Cape Girardeau firemen, and they could see undoubtedly people with flashlights and lanterns, the farm family, the police, maybe using their car headlights to illuminate the area. So it wasn't completely dark. And people were walking around picking up this debris when the flames were being put out. And there was metallic debris all over the ground from this crashed, round, silvery gray spaceship. It was not a long cylindrical airplane whatsoever. No wings, no propellers, no struts, no nothing. And that had to have been a real shock to people. Like, what in the world is this? And then they found 3 bodies. 2 were right near the wreckage, as if someone had pulled them out and laid them on their backs. And a third not too far away who was still breathing. His chest was going up and down. And otherwise, he was limp and silent. And Reverend Huffman had been called to say prayers and give spiritual comfort. Well, the first 2 were dead. So he knelt down next to this third body, and we'll describe it in a second. But he said, as I was saying my prayers, he seemed to expire. He went limp, no more breathing, no sign of life. He was dead. Now, what did he say the bodies were? big, round, gray heads with no hair, big black eyes like a doll, almost like a big black-eyed shark or something, but tiny dots for nostrils, no nose, a tiny slit for a mouth, no ears, no tattoos or markings or piercings or jewelry of any kind, and strange, limp bodies that looked just like they were dolls. Apparently, two people at the site lifted up one under the arms and had him pose for a picture. This body was dead. And they held out his arms, and they were just like limp rubber. And they were extraordinarily long arms by our human standards, apparently maybe with 3 long fingers and a thumb. Yeah. And super crinkly, wrinkly skin, or a tight fitting flight suit of some kind. It might have been almost like a combination of both, or it might have been their skin that reacted very poorly to the Earth's oxygen-rich atmosphere, which they apparently could not breathe. That may have been what killed them, not the crash, not the impact, not being pulled out, but they can't breathe our air. They weren't meant to be outside the environmental climate control of their spaceship. And so to back that up, there's a quick anecdote I put in my book. General George C. Marshall met with a scientist in Mexico City in the late 50s. And there had been a UFO sighting over the airport where they were waiting for General Marshall to land. One of the scientists said, I talked to General Marshall, asked him, what's with these spaceships? And he said, 3 have crash landed in America that we know of. And all 3 of them could not breathe our atmosphere and burned up on the inside. Their inner organs like incinerated, but they had no visible injuries on the outside. And that's exactly what Reverend Huffman said. He could not see any injuries. Like, what happened to these guys?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, they were only like 3.5 to 4 feet tall at most, and like difficult to describe since they're so very different. But with these huge heads, they had to have looked like, I don't know, just weird dolls. They were identical, as if punched out of the same mold, and they were almost like made in a factory.
Yeah.
And if you remember Colonel Philip Corso and his Day After Roswell book.
Oh, yeah, definitely.
Yeah. He said that was the Army's private conclusion that these almost identical ones from Roswell, our scientists came to the conclusion that these were creatures created by a higher race to do their dirty work, to go out and scout ships. And they were like biological robots that were kind of part real creatures and yet programmed, and they didn't think and feel like we do, had no particular sentiment towards humans and their feelings, and did what they were programmed to do, accumulate data and go on long flights and scout ships and come back to a mothership. So I find that very plausible in the Cape Girardeau story. Sounds just like it, since, they were all alike and maybe made in a cloning laboratory. And since the aliens, didn't come back and say, give us our fallen brethren. We want our spaceship and our aliens back. It was really a dime a dozen. Then just go back to the factory and get some more. And so they didn't care that these 3 creatures died. The humans were on the scene of the crash so fast, they really couldn't take them back unless they came in by force. And so Reverend Huffman was just astounded. And he watched this creature being hoisted up by 2 men and a photographer who was apparently a newsman with a local newspaper, probably the Southeast Missourian, which is still in business today. Had a big old speed graphic like you see in old movies, this huge camera with flash bulbs and everything.
Yeah.
But he put that aside, pulled out a small Brownie pocket camera, and snapped one photo. And it's interesting to know that a newsman for the local paper was named Garland D. Fronebarger. In a roundabout way, he was related to my family. And my aunt saw him and met him in our family home in the 1950s, I think she said. And he pulled out, he didn't pull out, but he recommended a small Brownie box camera to her. He encouraged her to use photography. He says, that's what I use to take photos. So bingo, this guy looks like he fits the mold in every way.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, I contacted his son, who was still alive in Arizona, and he said, I don't know. My dad didn't tell me, but he was secretive about some things and very talkative about others. So he could have known the whole story, and for my best interests, kept it to himself. That he was probably warned, do not open your mouth on this if you want to live, if you want your family to live. And so that's possible. We don't know that for sure. But it sounds like what Reverend Huffman said happened to him, that they took him off to one side and swore him, maybe even on his own Bible, you will not speak of this again. And it's interesting to note that even though he was a good man and believed in the Bible, a true Christian, he went home and broke that oath that night and told his family everything. So that was the only time he talked about it. And they were very anxious and upset. What was this phone call? You went out of the house. And why are you so pale and shaken? And, what's wrong with you? What happened? What did you see? So he told his family to kind of put them at ease. And yet this is a wild story. Would it put you at ease? I don't know if he slept or anyone in that household slept that night after he revealed to his wife, his son, his two sons, but not his pregnant daughter-in-law who was upstairs. They didn't want to disturb her. She was a week away from giving birth. They didn't want anything going wrong. So that was understandable. The family moved away from Cape Girardeau in the 40s. One of the sons of Reverend Huffman died in battle in World War II in Europe. So that was another reason to move along to Oklahoma and start a new life there. And but before they moved, 2 weeks after the crash, the photographer who had taken that little snapshot came up to Reverend Huffman as he sat on his front porch and said, I have a copy of this photograph and I want you to have a copy. Reverend Huffman apparently didn't really want it. It's hot potato. It's evidence of the crash. But it's obvious that the photographer and newsman recognized Huffman from the scene and knew that he had been there, and maybe they'd even spoken to each other, and he wanted him to have a copy. And it makes you wonder, well, how many copies did the newsman make? Were there other copies delivered to other people? And yet this photograph has never surfaced. You see on the internet a recreation of two men in 40s attire with like a fedora and a 40s suit holding up this dead alien. Well, that was just a recreation for a 2003 sci-fi documentary called The Secret, Evidence That We're Not Alone. And it spent about 2.5 minutes and did a good job on the Cape Girardeau story, showing Reverend Huffman going to the scene from 1941. So it's almost everything that has been alleged hangs together fairly well without this hard proof. Someone's diary, someone's home movie footage, someone's snapshot that they took, if it could only surface. But it makes you think that maybe the government took care of it. Anyone with evidence. We'll get to a story about that in a minute.
Oh, here's some of my questions I had. So, Huffman, you were saying, and I know you said it in his book, and you were kind of saying it just a minute ago, he didn't want the story to go public, right? Since he was sworn to secrecy.
He didn't want to talk about it. He probably didn't want to hear other people talk about it. He had been warned, and he was a man of God, and he had sworn, maybe on his own Bible, to keep his mouth shut. So he didn't want any trouble. A story like this, if you're unfamiliar with it in Cape Girardeau, you might think this guy's gone crazy. A pastor talking about space aliens? No one talked about such a thing. And then if you had revealed that, well, I was sworn on my patriotic duty to keep my mouth shut, well, then it looks like you're a squealer if you go forward. So there's two reasons to, you don't want to be thought of as a tattletale or a lunatic or something. So it was effectively squelched in his family.
To me, it seems like that adds some credibility to him in a sense that he kind of kept his promise and didn't say anything. But it was his granddaughter that was the one that started speaking to investigators, right?
Right. She had seen as a little girl in the early 1950s, at least a dozen times, this resulting photograph that apparently Reverend Huffman's son held on to. That would have been her father, William Guy Huffman Jr. And he was married and had two daughters, and Charlotte Mann, at that time, Charlotte Huffman, was able to view this photograph when they would haul it out at family parties and whisper about this space alien thing that they had, or that Reverend Huffman had seen. Huffman died in 1959. I don't think Charlotte was able to speak to him at all about the incident, and he wasn't talking anyway. But she saw that photograph, and she said it really gave me the creeps, that it had this big black-eyed alien being held up by two men and looked like a lifeless doll almost, but that it was like a photograph of, looky what we found. And they might have thought, when they were rich and world famous, man, when this hits the press. But the military had been called in and surrounded the site, Reverend Huffman said, and said, put down that debris, no souvenirs. You're not to touch this stuff. You're not to talk about it. Get away from the crash. And they were taken off to the side in groups and sworn to never speak of it again. Now, how could the military be there so quickly? Reverend Huffman was called in around like 9 o'clock at night, probably arrived and was looking around by 9:30.
Yeah.
The sheriff of Cape Girardeau was a former Sikeston resident, and his brother was a executive within an aerial training program associated with the U.S. Army Air Corps in the Sikeston, Missouri airfield. And they knew each other, obviously, the two brothers. And all it took was a quick phone call. Like the sheriff said, you got to get up here and see this. This is not from this world. So quickly, a military unit was assembled. They drove about 35 miles up north, or headed north from Sikeston to Cape Girardeau, and took over the site, and apparently picked up all the evidence they could and the bodies, and trucked it on down to Sikeston, where it may have lasted a day or two and was flown out of there because I don't think the government even wanted the Sikeston personnel associated with the military to have it either. It was red hot stuff, like totally unprecedented. Remember, Roswell hadn't even happened. It wouldn't happen for 6 years. No one knew anything like this. It had to have been really bizarre, but a top secret. Now, why would they rush in and try to keep this top secret instead of just going ahead and telling the press? Cape Girardeau had an FBI man open up a field office the month before the crash. There had been spies and saboteurs in the Cape area because there were a lot of Germans, especially German farmers, and a small percentage of them were loyal to Nazi Germany. And apparently this was something that they did not want these spies and saboteurs to get their hands on or to know about. They wanted it to remain top secret so we could perhaps weaponize it and do something to defeat the Nazis, which I think they did actually, but they wanted to keep everything hush hush so that Hitler and the Nazi forces and the Empire of Japan, which were rampaging across the world in 1941, would not get any knowledge, and we would have a top secret, possible secret weapon. When it was about 7 months later, Pearl Harbor was attacked and we were at war. And so everyone in Cape Girardeau kind of scattered. All the men joined the service. The chief of police, for example, Edward Camp, was a very fine man. He joined the Seabees, went to the Pacific, and died in battle in 1945. Wow. So that's an example of how this story, again, could get kind of lost and fall through the cracks as people scattered all over the world, and some didn't come back.
So here's some of my other questions. So when William, when he went to the crash site, did he say he was, did you know if he was scared? Did he say it was chaotic? I know you were saying that there was like some fires going and there was some first responders there.
Right.
Was it like chaotic or was it kind of orderly? Or
I would think it was a bit chaotic with the fire department stamping out this fire. I'm sure in a farm field there wasn't any hose, like a fire hydrant and drag a hose in. But fire trucks did have a tank of water in those days, but they knew other methods of stamping out incendiary devices or flammable material. And so there was a fireman named Walter Reynolds who said late in life, you know, this story about Reverend Huffman and the UFO? The whole thing is true. I was there. I fought the fire. I saw the spaceship. I saw the 3 bodies. The military came in and chewed us out, and they chewed me out when I tried to put a piece of shrapnel in my pocket. They caught me, he said.
Oh.
And Fireman Reynolds was on his own deathbed with cancer when he admitted all of this to his family. And his grandson came forward to tell the story. It's pretty awesome. But he said the military did not take too kindly to my trying to sneak a little piece of the debris and make a souvenir so I could tell people later. So they kicked him out of the site that night. And he said that in the aftermath, he was being watched around town, maybe followed. The FBI was in town, and that his phone was tapped. And I was a little dubious at that at first. And then I found out the FBI was crazy about wiretapping in those days. There was very little in the way of law to prevent it. And the FBI found a way around it. J. Edgar Hoover was creating a huge, thick book of people he was wiretapping and keeping an eye on. It sounds pretty outrageous, but it happened. So it's plausible this could have happened, as he said. And so he kept his mouth shut until he was ill with cancer late in life. So there's another piece of the story. It sounds plausible, but even he had no proof. They took the proof away. And so it's even he fighting the fire and seeing all this stuff. I don't know if they were scared. I don't know if Reverend Huffman ever said he was scared, but they had to have been pretty nervous. Not only was this hard to look at, but you had to have been thinking, is anyone else going to show up? Are they watching us right now in the dark night sky up above? And are they going to land? Or is this the start of an alien invasion? Are we about to go to war? They had to have been thinking the worst. And I'm sure when a chain of command phone calls went up to the War Department, General Marshall, Henry Stimson, the Secretary of War, and the President of the United States, I think were notified probably that night. They had to have been wondering too, well, what's going on? Are we about to be invaded? And their minds had to have come back to the October 30th, 1938 radio broadcast War of the Worlds with Orson Welles, which touched off a panic. And there was yet another reason to keep this tamped down and don't let it out, lest we have people grabbing their guns and running out into the street like they did for the War of the Worlds fictional radio broadcast. People were warned over and over during that broadcast, this is just a radio play of an old H.G. Wells book. It's fictional, but they didn't listen. Many people thought that it was the end of the world, and they panicked. So supposedly 1 or 2 guys had heart attacks. And this was another reason to keep the whole thing clamped down on. We can't have folks quitting their jobs, running out in the street, shooting everything that moves, in fear. So it makes sense, doesn't it? To tamp down on this right from the beginning.
So you said Huffman, they kind of left town a few years after this happened. Was it months or years after it happened? You were saying
1944, about 3 years later.
Okay.
He moved to Kingfisher, Oklahoma, where he became a Baptist minister in their church. And it was common in those days, and maybe still to this day, for preachers to be hired and then moved around from church to church.
Because I was going to say, he didn't move as a result of this, right? He kind of, no one really knows.
In fact, I think he kept his mouth shut. He was hired full-time as a preacher after being more of a fundraiser in early 41. And he was thought highly. He thought he had a future in Cape Girardeau and bought that house he had been renting in. And the people of the community thought highly. He was not in any way a wild man prone to crazy stories, not from what I heard from people and not from his granddaughter. He was a very fine gentleman. So he had to have had this dark secret, but others did too. Where is their confession? The sheriff, the policemen who were there. There were a couple of people, there are hints and allegations that they did talk, but it's so darn third hand or fourth hand that somebody said, and that this person was there. There's a man who contacted me and said his mother knew about the spaceship crash, and I hadn't heard it before. And she told me about it, and I want to tell you what I can remember of what she told me. And she said she was about 14 years old and lived up the street from Reverend Huffman and was on her way to school, apparently the morning after, and saw Reverend Huffman looking haggard and poking around the yard. He was into horticulture, gardening. And this little girl asked her, "What's wrong? You know, you look too good." And Reverend Huffman supposedly told her. I find it a little difficult to believe that he would tell a 14-year-old girl, but she helped him around the yard while he was telling the story, said that he was taken into the back of a military truck and sworn by an FBI agent not to talk, but he just felt like he had to tell someone, and that he saw the bodies and the crash. And this is what this grandson said, or the son of a woman who grew up and then passed away, but she did tell the story. And so that could be true, or maybe this guy's just making it up, but it fits.
Yeah.
Reverend Huffman would have been out in his yard. He did love gardening, and you would want to do something kind of normal, wouldn't you? To take your mind off this crazy thing. Yeah. So he could have been puttering around the yard, unable to sleep. Would you have been able to sleep?
Probably not.
Well, he looked at these bodies. He made sure not to touch them, by the way.
I kind of wonder what his religious beliefs, if they changed at all, if they stayed the same after seeing all that as well.
His granddaughter said the family noted that he became more open-minded to the supernatural or the unknown, and that he was always somewhat of a soft-spoken man, but he was just as much or more than ever, but that he was slightly changed by this incident, as you would think anyone would be.
Yeah, for sure.
But again, he made sure not to touch the bodies. He told his wife, who told the daughter, who told the world. And so, again, there's like a chain of people who tell the story and retell it. And when you play the old game telephone, you pass along a rumor, and sometimes that thing gets messed up. Well, there's that possibility in this case too. So there's little bits and pieces that add up, and I'm getting more little clues as I polish this story yet again to try to put my first two books on the subject together in one really big modern compendium that has all the latest information. I wish our government would come across with the information. Apparently, they're not going to talk about it. There won't be any disclosure. They've made that clear recently. So unless someone from the government leaks a file or someone hacks into a file from outside the government, guess we're not going to get the full Cape Girardeau story. And I can't track down this 95-year-old woman who may know things from her husband, who apparently was there and saw things. So again, it's just very, very frustrating to research, but it's exciting. It's historic. I think it really did happen. And, Cape Girardeau has not captured this in spirit or capitalized it on it financially. Roswell has the museum, take a tour, T-shirts, everything. You go to Cape Girardeau, there's nothing. You'll find nothing. Maybe my book on sale somewhere, but other people. It's a conservative church-going small town of 20,000 in 1941. It's a conservative church-going community of 40,000 here in 2023. And some people are fascinated by the story, and others don't want to hear it. Their minds just snap. No, I don't want to talk about that. I don't want to think about that. So, you just don't know what you're going to get.
So my other question, I was like, so you were saying that, I know when Huffman got there was already some other civilians on the site. Do you know roughly, or you might not know this, do you know roughly about how long the civilians were there before the military showed up?
The landowner apparently saw the fireball, heard the crash, ran inside, called the local operator, and they contacted the police and the fire department in Cape Girardeau in those days. They were in the same headquarters downtown. So they all thought it was a plane crash. Pardon me. And they all probably put out a word, let's get a doctor, maybe a nurse, maybe more than one at the local hospital, and send them over. And I've uncovered a story about an educator, a man who worked in a school whose girlfriend was a nurse. And he told her, or she told him, we saw the bodies, and my fellow nurses and I, our faces went white with fright. We'd never seen anything like this before. It just shocked us.
Yeah.
So, that's claimed, and there's no hard proof of this, but it fits the story that it would have been a noble gesture on local first responders, doctors, nurses, police, firemen, FBI agent to look into what they thought was going to be an airliner crash and find out it was, in fact, a spaceship from another world. So little drips of the story got out, and then working on a how contacted by some. He knew about the story from an employee of his, and his employee turned out to have an uncle who knew about the crash because he was there at the time. And I'm trying to track this down. And, people have scattered all over the globe or forgotten details, or the uncle has long since passed away. So they got to remember what was said 10, 20, 30 years ago about what was said 80 years ago. And so it's just so darn tough.
Do you know about how many military men arrived at the site and what they did with the UFO?
I don't. It probably didn't take much more than 8 or 9 to circle around. Reverend Huffman said they encircled the site and moved in. I assume they had some firearms to show that they meant business and that they were in uniform, probably from Army Air Corps and the Missouri Institute of Aeronautics, where they were training sites. That's the best bet. Now, there's another factor. Cape Girardeau was home to a National Guard armory, and there were citizen soldiers in those days. So you never knew who your neighbor, and if you're talking to someone, they might snitch on you because this was told by the military, keep your mouth shut. And so people were afraid to talk. Reverend Huffman apparently said there was an atmosphere of fear in Cape Girardeau after the crash. People were afraid to talk, maybe more from government reprisal, having the military show up at your door to admonish you or threaten you, than fearing like aliens are going to come back and attack us. So there was a famous member of the Army training program in Cape Girardeau in 1906 named Harry S. Truman, lived in Cape Girardeau that summer.
Cool, yeah,
and he was a Washington, D.C. senator and Missouri's Grand Master Freemason. The mayor of Cape Girardeau was a Master Freemason, Knights Templar, and apparently a friend to Harry Truman, and met with him when he was a senator, when he was a vice president, and when he was president. This obscure mayor from Cape Girardeau just happened to meet with Harry Truman. So you've got to believe that the secretive organization knew the story of the crash. FDR was a 32-degree Freemason. His vice president was Henry Wallace in 1941 when Truman was a senator. And suddenly, FDR did not even support Truman in the 1940 election. Then there was a complete 180, and Truman just had to be put on the ticket. FDR wanted Truman, and he basically kicked Henry Wallace off the ticket and put this Missouri native who probably knew the score about Cape Girardeau's UFO crash and lived once for a while in Cape Girardeau as the next president. Roosevelt knew he wasn't going to make it through his next term. He thought he would retire as soon as the war was over, but he died before even that. And he handpicked Harry Truman. And could this be a big factor in that Truman did not need any briefing? He wouldn't be shocked by any business of a briefing from military officials saying we're being visited from creatures from another world, and here are the facts. He already knew the facts. So it's fascinating to contemplate that the whole course of American history could have been altered by what crash landed in some farmer's field outside of town just after dark. It was said to have been.
Something I thought was interesting. I never thought of this. I thought we could even use this, Nick, for our case that we were doing.
Yeah.
You were looking at presidential logs as far as like their I don't call it an activity log, or where it lists what they were doing at what days and what times.
Right. I've gone through digitized records for FDR, Truman, Eisenhower, LBJ, Kennedy, right up to Nixon. who's the subject of my upcoming book out May the 9th, The Nixon Gleason Alien Encounter. But we'll stick with Cape Girardeau here, so I won't plug.
We can talk about that a little bit later. Yeah, we'll talk about it later. Yeah.
Okay. Well, back in 1941, Roosevelt was carrying on a regular kind of schedule in the White House. In late April, I checked. He went for a weekend boat trip up the Potomac on like a Saturday and Sunday. I think that was the 23rd and 22nd, 23rd. I don't think he would have undertaken that, a leisurely little cruise on a yacht up the Potomac for 2 days, if this crash had happened beforehand. You know, you would have been thinking, we've got to talk to our top officials, maybe plot out a defense strategy. Could more be coming? I need reports from the field. You would have taken action, what to do with the crash debris, what to do with the spaceship, what to do with the 3 alien bodies. And you know, that's something we haven't talked about. Reverend Huffman said, after I saw the alien body being photographed and I had finished my prayers, he said, I went over to the spaceship and got a good peek. I looked on the inside. It was cracked open, and I'm sure people had flashlights and were shining them in there so we could see. He said he saw at least one tiny little seat, almost like you would have for a child. He saw gauges and dials like a dashboard or a control panel. He saw a silver metal ring at the upper ceiling of this flight deck or control area. And there were strange symbols in that silver metal that he did not recognize. Yeah. Like hieroglyphics or something. So he got a good gander, as anyone would, you know, let's go take a look and see what this thing looks like. He had a natural curiosity. I'm sure almost everyone there got a long look if they were bold enough to step up. Yeah. And to look at the bodies and get a good look, because at the first they didn't know the military was going to come in and tell them to shut up. They probably couldn't wait to run home and tell their families, whether they lived on an adjoining property or nearby, or they were a nurse or doctor. I'm sure they all wanted to see what they thought would be historic and make the headlines across the world the next day. But the military said, you will not write about this. No photographs. They took the pictures or the film, but that photographer had that little box camera, his hobby camera, in his pocket, and he snuck it out of the crash site without telling the military. He got away with this one photograph. Yeah. And it's interesting to note that Garland Fronebarger was known as one-shot Frony. He would take one picture with his camera and walk away. My mother said she met him in the 50s when she went to college. She was with a group of young ladies, and he had them pose, one shot, took a picture, and then we walked away. And that fits the profile exactly of this guy. You would think he would want all the pictures he could take, but he was apparently a bit of a cheapskate when it came to film. So he didn't take too many photos, only when really necessary. And he would take one picture and walk off. So that may have been that guy. And it's just another clue in the story that it could well be true. His son seems to think it's at least possible. And the photograph never made it to the newspapers and magazines. So we'll never know for sure, I guess.
Do you think that photo is out there somewhere, in your opinion, or do you think anyone will ever find it?
Probably not. I'd like to think that he lived on North Park Avenue in Cape Girardeau, and I wrote to the current property owners and never heard back. Do you think you could search your house, like the attic, crawl space, some heating, venting pipes, maybe down in the basement, see if anything squirreled away of this nature? When he retired from the newspaper in Cape Girardeau, he had an auction. My father attended that auction, and here's all his photographs laid out. You could buy anything you want. And many of them were snapped up, but I doubt if he would put super sensitive, top secret photos like that out for display to pick up a few bucks. But you never know what he made copies of. And so it has not surfaced. I don't have a lot of confidence that it ever will, but that would be awesome if he made a copy for somebody somewhere and they finally said, you know, I'm on my deathbed, I'm going to go ahead and reveal this. Or here's a diary that my father kept. and I don't really want anything to do with this story, but I want to get it out, and you can make of it what you will. Or here's a photograph somebody took of from another angle before the police had arrived, and they snuck that out, or home movie footage or something. So that has not surfaced. I'm still mildly optimistic that something could happen like that. But as 82 years have gone by, and so far, no luck.
So, Nick, do you have any questions for Paul real quick? Because I have more questions. I just wanted to let you get a few questions in since I keep kind of asking a bunch.
I was just reading real quickly about the crash. I found a paper that was talking about some kind of a gas or something that might have caused the hallucination.
Well, I haven't heard that one before.
Oh, it was written by another researcher. But
specifically about Cape Girardeau or any alien crash that there could be.
Cape Girardeau specifically. I was just, in general, was there any stories of any weird sensations like telepathic phenomena?
It's a good question. Yeah, I have not read of anything of the sort. I hope you will email me a copy or a link, of this paper that you read. I guess they're speculating that such a thing could have happened. That you would not have wanted to touch anything for bacteria and germs from another world or from another species, whether it's the creatures who created the craft and the bio robots that manipulated it, or from the robot type aliens themselves. So it's possible crazy fumes could have come out of there, but I haven't heard of anything like that. Reverend Huffman never mentioned that. Neither did the fireman, Walter Reynolds.
Let's see. Did you have another question, Nick? Because I have a whole bunch I was going to ask.
I'm going to forward you the links for the paper that I got, and then we can forward it.
Okay, yeah. I can send it to Paul. Let's see. While Nick's sending that, so I know you said you don't have to talk about the exact location. I know I'm not asking you to do that, but do you have a general idea where the crash site is, and have you been there? I guess is my next question.
I do. I've driven around a number of times. There's one site that fits all. I've collected about 15, 16 clues, and they all point to this one site. One of them was a letter sent by a man anonymously to the KFVS television production, and it was forwarded to me, and it confirms again where this generally happened. But we have to keep in mind this is private property. It's someone's home and business, and they don't want a bunch of people trooping around in their property, crushing their crop that they worked hard to build, from the ground up, to grow and then harvest. They can't have litter and garbage or people going to the bathroom in their property, trying to dig up the spaceship or the evidence, and tramping day and night, making noise, camping out. It would be a nightmare. In Roswell, it's the open desert. It's the middle of nowhere where this thing hit. And anyone could go there and start poking around. No one's going to stop you. But in Cape Girardeau, you might get a shotgun barrel aimed at your face. And I was reminded a number of times, the cropland itself is riddled with copperheads and rattlesnakes, looking for groundhogs, squirrels, chipmunks, rodents, rats, They're growing fat and they're ferocious. You don't want to get bit. You better wear some pretty tough boots, mister, I was told, if you're going to go out on that property. So there's another good reason to stay off somebody else's land.
Do you think?
I suspect someone will try it. Good luck.
You think that if you asked them, they'd let you, like you, since you're the main researcher of the case, go out there maybe and look around?
I would accept an offer to do that, but I wouldn't want it televised.
Yeah.
I wouldn't want, let's say, someone with a video camera getting me, or forget me, like, here's some evidence we found in the ground. And in the background, there's all these recognizable homes or businesses or trees or something, where you put this on the air, somebody figures it out, and presto, here comes half the world down on this situation on the site itself. Now, on the Topics forum, which used to be an online site for posting information, I collected clues from that. And in around 2013, a gentleman, 2011, 2012, 2013, a gentleman said, my grandparents owned the farm where the crash occurred. After the war, World War II, they sold the property to a gentleman and did not tell him about any UFO crash. So the grandson said, I flew to Cape Girardeau and went to the crash site. And sure enough, here's still that same gentleman. And he wasn't told of any crash, but he decided to dig up ground and put in a cistern, which is a large metal tank to collect rainwater that you could put on your crops in time of drought, or your house plants, or your laundry, or whatever you wanted to do with. It was a very common thing for farmers to do that. And in digging this up, he said, I found the weirdest bits of metal in the soil, and they couldn't be bent or creased permanently. They couldn't be cut. He had some tough shears, scissors, cutters on the farm for like cutting barbed wire or stuff like that. And he couldn't cut it with that. And he said there were strange hieroglyphic symbols that he could not understand imprinted in the metal, according to this Topics forum poster. He claimed all of this. He didn't give his name, didn't give the exact site, but he did give a clue or two where this was. And again, fits with all the information that I've accumulated, where I pretty much know where this happened. But it's dangerous. I've lately been accumulating a number of stories where you could be harassed, threatened by government people to this day. I know a certain host named Jeremy who experienced some of this some years ago when he looked into a UFO affair, and he'll tell you about it right now. But I don't need that, so I'm not going to go any further.
On that point. So we do have a location we visited and scouted several times of the pictures we've shown you before the show. For the first few times we went to this purported crash site, you could get in very easy to the area. I mean, it was just a short walk or an ATV ride down an old dirt road. But the last time, a couple of years ago, when we went to go back to the crash site, it has been all fenced off with a padlock, gate. And locals in the area just said, oh, it's a reclamation project. They didn't start this reclamation project for 50, 60 years until we started looking at this area as a
what a coincidence.
Oh,
that's something to look for in Cape Girardeau, in this general area that I know of. If I go back there, if it's suddenly fenced in, gee, wonder what that could be for. Reclamation. They're reclaiming the land, even though it's been farmed on a million times. Another problem is this farmland is frequently flooded. And now we've seen in the news the Mississippi River is starting to flood up at north, and it eventually makes its way to Cape Girardeau. We went through a number of floods when I was a boy, and it's something to see, man. It's scary that the tributaries head out. They're funneled into farm fields, and then the farm fields flood. And I've seen the general area of the Cape crash underwater completely. So there's another factor that as stuff could have been washed away, you could find it 20 miles downstream in theory, and not know what this is. So there's another, Mother Nature is another factor over time that could have affected this soil.
So the next few questions are kind of general questions. So what do you think led you to find some good evidence or good witnesses to piece the story together when other researchers in like the 90s and early 2000s couldn't find anything? You think it's because you live there local, or?
Yeah, I think Ryan S. Wood meant well, and at times he got fairly close to the area that I'm pretty sure is it, that all my clues point to.
Yeah.
But he generally went to other areas and was in the wrong spot back around 2000 when he did a ground search, and he had some serious people with him. Now, I had a friend from high school contact me a couple of years ago. And when Ryan Wood and Stanton Friedman were in Cape Girardeau around the year 2000, 2001, my high school buddy said, I heard about this and I was intrigued. I really wanted to know more. And I tried to contact him and offered to be their guide in town. And I started checking out UFO books from the library. And one day he said, I went into the library, and the librarian said, I want to tell you something. 2 men in suits were here asking about you. They were asking about what books you were reading and what you were doing.
Yeah.
And, you know, dum, da, dum, dum.
Yeah.
The government knew he was on the case, didn't like it. We're asking questions around the year 2000. And that's a little indication that the story is real. You wouldn't send federal agents to start poking around in the private lives of Cape Girardeau citizens and what they're reading at the local library for a hoax or for a nothing. So they really do hold this story dear. I got a message from someone on Facebook that said, I live a few miles away. And we also had federal agents show up, one claiming to be from NASA, one from like National Security Administration. And they were allegedly looking at this old tower on an adjoining property that was used during the war. And they just happened to steer the conversation. Have you heard anything about a 1941 crash of, you know, some sort?
Geez, yeah.
Yeah. So it was, this woman said it was pretty obvious what they were doing there and what they were up to. And again, you don't do this unless it was truly an alien event. They're looking for witnesses who might talk. They're looking for clues of any sort to keep it tamped down. And I think effectively, in general, it has been. But it's made a few newspapers. It's made this documentary film that was on the Sci-Fi Channel. I think you can find it online. Look up The Secret: Evidence That We're Not Alone. And it's been on the History Channel through Ancient Aliens and Hangar One, a show that was on History Channel. I'm not sure, but they did a piece on Cape Girardeau too. And so I'd love to see a major motion picture, but it's so tough to recreate the 40s, the cars, the hairstyles, the clothes. You'd have to have a major, big budget production, someone with a lot of money like Steven Spielberg. Now, Steven Spielberg, I have little doubt, landed many times on the Cape Girardeau airfield that wasn't too far from the crash site. And you know why? He was dating Kate Capshaw, who was from Chaffee, Missouri.
Oh, dang. Yeah.
Yes. And her daughter was growing up being raised by Kate's ex-husband. And Steven Spielberg and Kate would go there to drop her off with custody or to pick her up. And they went in and out of the Cape airport, the nearest one.
Yeah.
What they know of this story, they could have driven right past this field and not known it, or maybe they know the story. And so I attempted to contact one of the Capshaws and never heard back. I don't know if some people are thinking the story is kooky, that it's a waste of time, or that they know the truth and they ain't talking.
Yeah.
It's one way or the other, and you're out. You don't get any answers.
I have a good one. This is kind of like just off the cuff. So if somebody were to contact you, just say like the FBI, government, military, and they threatened you to not do the research anymore or tried to scare you, would you still do the research at that point? Or you think you would stop doing it? Or
boy, I don't know. I would like to tell you I'm brave and strong and I'll defy the government, but probably I would do what I was told. I mean, if they're ordering, threatening you, I'm just one person. No one ever has. No one has been tailing me around. I've been told by a source of mine who has lots of contacts that the books I write are, quote, being allowed, that there's like a gradual disclosure in this country, and they're letting private citizens dig into some things so that they don't have to admit to things. And that the stuff I get into on Franklin Roosevelt, Harry Truman, Dwight Eisenhower, and Nixon were so long ago, 50, 60, 70 years ago, that they don't really care if I uncover some truths, some theories, and piece it all together. And I'm just a nobody in general, although my books get good reviews. And my manager, my agent, is trying to get a movie deal. It's so tough. Hollywood, you have to recreate things through special effects. That costs a lot. And then recreating the 40s, as I've mentioned, costs a lot. And so someone with some real guts, like a Steven Spielberg, would have to get behind us. Now, I have a friend of a friend who asked Steven Spielberg, and he said he's out of the spaceship movie business. He doesn't want to do UFOs anymore. He did Close Encounters, E.T., The Extraterrestrial, and I think he was a producer on a couple more. ET type stories, and he doesn't really want to do that anymore. So there's like strike three.
Yeah.
Strike three, we're out.
Let's see. Do you think your book coming out kind of revived the story in a way and got a little bit more attention to it? Maybe.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah.
For it to be on Ancient Aliens and them to talk about it. And I've done interviews with Linda Moulton Howe, who has recommended my book. In fact, she's got a video, and she said, she held up my book and said, I wish everyone in the whole world could read this book. And I thought, wow, what a great endorsement there. There's some book sales for you. Go, Linda, go. But I don't have her fame, her pull, her influence. But when she's in my corner, that's helpful. Linda Moulton Howe said once years ago she was confronted by like a federal agent, and he tried to kind of browbeat her. And she said, I was so naive. I said, we live in a representative democracy and I have freedom of speech. And, this guy was saying, no, you really shouldn't be doing this,
Yeah.
And she said, I just kind of got out of it by being naive. And at the time, she didn't really realize the full implications of what this man was implying, that you need to keep your mouth shut about something that's going on, and we don't want to set off a panic. Do we really think here in 2023 there would be a panic? I don't think so. It's so mainstream that we have had books, comic books, movies, TV shows, sitcoms, My Favorite Martian, Mork from Ork, and on and on and on about aliens, that people are just used to it. And a few years ago, there were revelations by the government admitting these tic-tac UFOs and these radar returns and these pilot sightings are real. And it was almost like, ho-hum, the government kind of admits we are being watched. And there wasn't that much of a reaction.
Yeah.
I wish they would do some more disclosure. If you saw a 60 Minutes piece, they had an actual set of military people, and one of them said, we are pilots. We see these things all the time. Pilots tell me we see these things every single time we go out in an airplane, for our government on a mission.
Yeah.
Tic-tacs, probes, drones of an alien nature, discs, cylindrical alien craft. We are being watched by probably a variety of races. We're utterly fascinating to observe. So we became very close to the atomic age at the time of the 1941 crash. We were just starting to put together high-tech stuff like nuclear weapons, and on the brink of possibly destroying our planet. And hopefully that will not happen. Now, I'm going to share with you something that happened to me in early April, just real quick. I had a very unusual dream. I saw 2 nuclear bomb blasts creating huge mushroom clouds in the distance. Scary stuff. And the caption for my dream said, May 2023. And I woke up really worried. And I've seen nothing but scary stuff that Iran is threatening to demolish or destroy 2 cities in Israel. They're threatening to destroy Tel Aviv and Haifa because they don't dare destroy Jerusalem. And how do you destroy 2 cities? Well, I assume by firing a nuclear bomb or dropping them from an airplane. And the North Koreans are threatening to use nuclear weapons. The Russians and Putin have been threatening to fire nuclear weapons rather than lose the Ukrainian war. And China is close to invading Taiwan. And we've never been closer. And I'm really nervous about the month of May, that we could see my dream come true. I sure hope not, but I just want to establish, for the record, I did see this in early April, and it better not happen. I hope it's a lot of nonsense.
I mean, that is pretty scary, yeah.
Yeah.
I got one quick
we're
question.
On the cusp of May now. I didn't say what day in May, but hopefully there will not be 2 nuclear bombs dropped, and this will be my dream will be a lot of nonsense, but
hopefully.
We'll see.
I was going to say, when I was looking through the material, there was a Mr. Fisk who was an insurance agent.
Right.
Did you come across him in your research?
He had passed away just before I got started. But here's the story with Walter Wayne Fisk. He lived in the small town of in Kansas where Charlotte Huffman and her family lived. And they were getting this photograph of an alien out at dinner parties. Well, Walter Fisk was an insurance agent who came to their dinner party. and saw the photograph and was quite intrigued and said, I have a friend who knows, or I know something about photography, and I'll take a look at this at length. And I have a friend who's into like zoology, botany, biology, and he'll take a look at it and we'll get it back to you real soon. He took off later that week and never came back, never brought the photograph back, never mailed it back down. At first, he told where saw this photograph, and then he told another interviewer, "Yeah, I saw the photograph, but I gave it back to them." And of course, neither story is true. He seemed evasive, and he skirted around. They will Army intelligence and the boarding family, and that's why he ended up in Albuquerque, which is a major U.S. Air Force and intelligence center. You may have heard of Manzano storage facility that's alleged to have had space alien craft brought in secret for examination by American scientists and Sandia Labs. And Los Alamos Labs are not far away. So that's where this guy just happened to end up. And he was with military intelligence, and he got that photograph that the newsman handed 2 weeks after the crash to Reverend Huffman. So Mr. Walter Wayne Fisk passed away, and there were no further interviews or revelations. And again, it's so frustrating. It's like trying to nail Jello to a wall to get some hard facts and some proof in this case. And I never will. By the way, the forum poster who said the farmer found that metal, he said the farmer had it in a container in his barn and would not show it to me. And then he said the barn was torn down a few years ago, and the farmer and his evidence seemed to just kind of disappear. Whether the farmer was scared and buried it somewhere, put it in a bank vault, or the government came in and took it by force, I don't know. But it's another example of here's some really solid evidence, very exciting sounding story, and we can't follow up on it.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. But before we end the show here, I was going to say, can you talk a little bit about your book that's coming out in May? And is there any kind of links or any other news that you would like to talk about?
Okay. After the Cape Girardeau story, I wanted to know more about this allegation that President Eisenhower met in person with friendly human-like aliens in 1954. His vice president was Richard Nixon, who was not at that meeting at Edwards Air Force Base, but he was briefed about it later on. And in his own time as president, supposedly Nixon took Jackie Gleason to Homestead Air Force Base in February 1973, the exact 19th anniversary of Eisenhower's encounter at Edwards Air Force Base, February 19th, 1954, where supposedly a treaty was formed with these friendly human-like aliens about them coming to visit here, keeping themselves on the down low. Don't show yourself. Eisenhower was very nervous about triggering a panic. He thought it would be social chaos if the aliens sat down somewhere and tried to talk to people. He asked them not to do this, so they signed some sort of treaty. And apparently Nixon went there on the day of the treaty to South Florida, just south of Miami. And that's the subject of my next book, taking Jackie Gleason and what they saw and what they did, and how interesting ties this had to the Eisenhower affair. And Eisenhower worked for Truman and Roosevelt back in the 40s. So some of this stuff all kind of hangs together. It's utterly fascinating. And I thank you for giving me a chance to plug this book, which comes out May 8th May 9th from Foundations and Amazon.com. And it'll be out in an audio book from Tantor.com. You can get the Eisenhower book also from Tantor.com. Terrific narration on this audio book. And you can get it in paperback form from Foundations. And my new sequel will come out soon. And I think people will find it fascinating. I don't really have anything about the Cape Girardeau story in those books, but I think you'll find them as intriguing, if not more intriguing, than the Mo 41 short for Missouri 1941 story that I have pieced together. And again, I'm trying to repiece it together with an all-encompassing new book that I hope maybe could come out later this year.
Oh yeah, we're gonna have you back on the show when your new book comes out. I was just talking to Nick about that in a text message a minute ago. Can you? I know I've been putting up the link to your MO41 website throughout the show. Is there another website or a social media page?
You can find me on Facebook. You can go to Cape Girardeau's 1941 UFO crash, America's First, which I think it was. And sometimes people send me little tidbits, little bits of information that they think will be helpful. And some of it was. And you can go to Eisenhower Nixon's Alien Encounters. That was another Facebook page I put together. I'm on Twitter and Instagram and Pinterest and LinkedIn. Mm-hmm. I don't really want to do these things, but you have to as an author in today's world. They make you do the social media to help promote yourself, to promote your books. And I've gotten used to it now. I had to be dragged kicking and screaming into the modern world of social media, but I'm used to it now. And so all these, I get little bits and pieces from folks who have intelligent things to share. If you have the truth, if you have facts or a reasonable theory you'd like to share, please do contact me, or you can contact my publishers. You'll find their address in the books, Foundations for the Eisenhower and Nixon books. And unfortunately, my Cape Girardeau story, Mo 41, their publisher is Argus Books, and they're going under. The owner of the company is very ill with cancer, and he's releasing us from our contracts. And so I think next month will be the last time you can get one of my original books. So that's another reason why I'm combining my two books on Cape Girardeau into one all new one, bigger and better than ever.
All righty. We're gonna end the show for tonight. I'm gonna have you and Nick stay on the line because we're gonna talk about something real quick after we end. But for everybody else that's tuning in, tune in next Saturday at 7 p.m. for our next show. We're gonna announce what that show is probably on Monday. And thanks everyone for tuning in tonight. Again, I'd like to thank Paul for coming on the show. We're gonna have you on again definitely when your new book comes out. We'll set something up. And in the meantime, I'm going to have you and Nick stay on, like I said, and we'll talk in just a minute.